I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders as I walked across the compound toward the communications bunker. 3 weeks at this outpost in the Colorado Rockies, and I still hadn't gotten used to how the temperature dropped once that mountain air started moving. Most of the other soldiers complained about the isolation out here, but honestly, I preferred it. After 18 months in Afghanistan, the quiet felt like a gift. The communications bunker sat squat and gray against the tree line, antennas sticking up from its roof like metal flowers reaching toward the sky. My assignment here was straightforward enough. Monitor radio traffic, maintain equipment, file reports. Nothing glamorous, but nothing that would get me shot at either. The Army had a way of giving you exactly what you didn't know you needed. Inside, the usual buzz of electronics greeted me. Banks of equipment lined the walls, their displays casting green and amber light across the cramped space. I settled into my chair and ran through the evening checklist, testing frequencies and logging signal strength. The routine had become comfortable, almost meditative. Sarah Johnson looked up from her station across the room. She'd been here 8 months longer than me, long enough to know every piece of equipment by heart. Her brown hair was pulled back in its usual bun, and she had that focused expression she wore when double-checking transmission logs. "Anything interesting today?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. Same as always. Background chatter from Peterson Air Force Base, some National Guard exercises down south. I pulled up my email to clear out the usual administrative garbage. Nothing worth writing home about. The inbox showed the typical mix of unit updates, maintenance schedules, and reminders about proper uniform standards. But there, sitting third from the top, was a message that made me pause. The sender was listed as unknown, and the subject line read Survival Guidelines. Read immediately. I stared at the screen for a few seconds. The timestamp showed it had arrived 20 minutes ago, right around the time I'd been walking over from the mess hall. Nobody used the communication system for personal messages, especially not from outside addresses we couldn't verify. I clicked it open. The message was longer than I'd expected, formatted like some kind of military briefing but written in plain English. No official letterhead, no unit designations, just 5 numbered points laid out in stark black text. 1. During power outages, lock yourself in your quarters immediately. Do not open your door for anyone, regardless of what you hear or who claims to need help. 2. If you encounter a soldier in uniform whose eyes are completely missing, run immediately to the nearest building with other people inside. Do not look directly at where the eyes should be. 3. On nights when the moon is full, avoid being outside alone after sunset. If you see a person in civilian clothes near the outer fence, do not make eye contact and return to base immediately. 4. If you hear your name being called from an empty room or building, do not check it out. Leave the area and find at least 2 other people to come with you if you must return. 5. Never enter a room where someone is sitting with their eyes closed, even if they appear to be sleeping. Back away slowly and report what happened to night security. I read through the list twice, my jaw moving as I tried to understand what I was looking at. Each rule was specific, detailed, like someone had taken the time to think through exactly what situations might come up. The tone was straightforward, almost like a manual, which somehow made it more disturbing than if it had been written like a typical ghost story. "Sarah?" I called across the room. "You ever see anything like this come through our system?" She rolled her chair over to look at my screen, her brow creasing as she read. "That's weird. The sender address doesn't match any format I recognize. Not military, not civilian contractors." She leaned closer, scrolling back up to check the header information. "I can run a trace on it, but honestly, this looks like someone's messing around with our filters." "Messing around how?" "Could be someone on base with too much time and a decent understanding of our network, or maybe an outside hacker testing our security." She shrugged. "Either way, it's not supposed to be there." I saved the email and forwarded a copy to my personal folder, then logged out of the system. The whole thing felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. The rules themselves were weird enough, but the way they were written suggested someone had put real thought into them. Not just random scary scenarios, but specific situations with specific responses. Later that evening, I found David Chen in our shared quarters, boots off and reading a paperback thriller he'd probably traded for cigarettes with someone in the motor pool. Dave had been my bunkmate since I'd arrived, and we'd gotten into an easy routine. He kept things light, never pushed too hard when I wasn't in the mood to talk, and had a knack for finding decent coffee in places where decent coffee shouldn't exist. "Check this out," I said, pulling up the email on my laptop. "Got this through the communications system today." Dave set his book aside and leaned over to read the screen. I watched his expression change from curiosity to disbelief to outright amusement. "Are you serious?" He started laughing before he'd even finished reading. "Someone actually took the time to write this? Don't enter rooms where people have their eyes closed? What kind of paranoid nonsense is that? I know it sounds crazy, but..." Sounds crazy. "Mike, this is someone trying to freak out the new guy. Probably been sending the same email to every fresh arrival for months." He scrolled back through the rules, shaking his head. "I bet if you asked around, half the guys who've been here longer than 6 months have gotten something similar." I wanted to argue with him, but his explanation made sense. Remote installations like this one created weird traditions. Hazing wasn't supposed to be tolerated, but that didn't stop creative soldiers from finding ways to mess with newcomers. And I was definitely the newest arrival on base. "You're probably right," I admitted. "Just seemed so detailed, like someone put real effort into it. That's what makes it good. Anyone can send a message saying, 'Watch out for ghosts.' This person actually thought it through, made it specific enough to sound believable." Dave closed the laptop and handed it back to me. "I guarantee you there's some specialist sitting in the motor pool right now, waiting to see if you're going to start jumping at shadows." I deleted the email and shut down the laptop. Dave's logic was sound, and I felt somewhat foolish for taking it seriously in the first place. Of course it was a prank. People loved creating ghost stories around isolated military installations, especially ones tucked away in mountains where the night sounds were different and the wind could make you hear things that weren't there. The rules had been written to exploit exactly the kind of worry that came with being stationed somewhere remote. Make someone afraid of power outages, and suddenly every flash of the lights becomes threatening. Tell them to watch out for people with missing eyes, and every dark spot starts looking suspicious. I changed into sleeping clothes and settled onto my narrow bunk. Through the small window, I could see pine trees swaying in the wind and the faint bright spots of security lights marking the perimeter. Peaceful, really. Nothing supernatural about it, just psychological warfare from bored personnel, I thought as I closed my eyes. Someone's idea of entertainment at the expense of fresh soldiers who didn't know any better. I'd been working the evening communications shift for 4 days since that weird email, and honestly, I'd almost forgotten about it. Dave had been right. Just someone trying to mess with the new guy. I'd even started joking about it with Sarah, making up ridiculous additions to the rules whenever we passed each other in the hallway. That changed the moment every light in the communications bunker died. The familiar buzz of electronics cut out instantly, leaving me sitting in complete darkness. My fingers were still on the keyboard where I'd been typing up a routine equipment report, the screen now black and silent. Outside, I could hear shouts from other buildings as the entire base lost power. Emergency lighting came on about 30 seconds later, bathing everything in hellish red. The backup generators kicked in with a low rumble, but they only powered essential systems: life support, emergency communications, basic lighting. The main computer banks stayed dark. I sat there for maybe 10 seconds, listening to the distant sounds of personnel responding to the outage. Standard procedure was to remain at your post unless specifically ordered otherwise. But then those stupid rules came back into my head, clear as if I was reading them off the screen again. During power outages, lock yourself in your quarters immediately. My hands started shaking before I could stop them. I tried to tell myself it was just coincidence, just my brain making connections where none existed. Power outages happened all the time at remote installations. Equipment failed, storms knocked down lines, generators needed maintenance, nothing supernatural about it. But I was already standing up, already reaching for my jacket. Sarah had left an hour earlier to grab dinner, and I was alone in the bunker. The red emergency lights made everything look wrong. I locked down the equipment as quickly as I could, my fingers fumbling with switches I'd operated hundreds of times before. The walk back to my quarters felt like it took forever. Every sound made me jump, boots on gravel, someone calling out instructions near the motor pool, the wind rattling a loose piece of metal somewhere in the darkness. I kept my head down and walked fast. Not running, but not exactly strolling either. My building housed about 20 enlisted personnel in single and double rooms. I shared mine with Dave, who was probably still in the mess hall playing cards with the motor pool guys. The hallway was empty, lit only by those red emergency bulbs every 20 feet. I got to my door and fumbled for my keys, hands still shaking like I'd been drinking too much coffee. The lock turned, and I stepped inside, immediately throwing the deadbolt behind me. Dave and I had laughed about that deadbolt when I'd first arrived. Who locks their door on a secure military base? But now, I was grateful for it. The room was dark except for the faint red glow seeping under the door. I didn't turn on my flashlight, didn't want to make any noise that might draw attention. Instead, I sat on my bunk and tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Emily Martinez was out there somewhere, running her usual perimeter patrol. She'd been assigned night security rotation for the past month, walking the fence line and checking access points. Professional, reliable Emily who'd never missed a scheduled check-in. If anyone could handle themselves during a power outage, it was her. I kept telling myself that as the minutes crawled by. The base had emergency protocols for power failures. Everyone knew their jobs, knew how to respond safely. Emily had backup communications, thermal gear, and years of training. She'd be fine. But I couldn't stop thinking about those rules. Around midnight, someone started knocking on my door. Light tapping at first, just 3 soft knocks like maybe someone was checking if I was awake. I held my breath, listening. The knocking came again, a little more insistent. "Mike?" Emily's voice muffled through the door. "Mike, are you in there?" Every muscle in my body went tight. I wanted to answer, wanted to get up and unlock the door, but something held me frozen on the bunk. Her voice sounded strained, like she'd been running. "Mike, please, I need help." The knocking got louder, more urgent. Something's wrong out here. Something's been following me since the lights went out. I bit down on my lip hard enough to taste blood. Emily was my friend, a fellow soldier who'd never asked me for anything before. She was scared and alone in the dark, and I was sitting there like a coward while she begged for help. "Please, Mike, I know you're in there. I can see light under your door." Her voice cracked. "Just let me in for a minute. I need somewhere safe until the power comes back." My hand was already reaching for the lock before I caught myself. The rule was clear. Don't open your door for anyone during a power outage, no matter what you hear or who claims to need help. But this was Emily. Real, flesh and blood Emily Martinez, who I'd seen every day for 3 weeks. "Mike, it's getting closer." I can hear it moving around the building. The knocking turned to pounding, desperate and frantic. Please just open the door. I'm right here. You can see it's really me." Tears started running down my face. I pressed my hands over my ears, but I could still hear her voice, still hear the terror in it. She was right outside, maybe 3 feet away, and something was hunting her in the darkness while I sat there and did nothing. "Oh God, it's here! Mike, it's right behind me! Mike!" The pounding stopped. I waited, every nerve in my body screaming, but there were no more sounds from the hallway. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. Just the distant buzz of emergency generators and the wind outside. I stayed on that bunk until dawn, staring at the door and listening for any sign that Emily was still out there. Part of me kept expecting her to start knocking again, to to hear her voice calling my name. But the hallway stayed quiet. The power came back around 6 in the morning, main lighting coming on with that familiar electrical buzz. I unlocked my door with shaking hands and stepped into the empty hallway. Everything looked normal. White walls, standard-issue carpeting, room numbers painted in black. I ran to the communications bunker and grabbed the radio, switching to Emily's patrol frequency. Security 7, this is communications base. Radio check, over. Static. Emily, this is Mike. Please respond, over. Nothing. I tried her personal radio, the backup frequency, even the emergency channel. Dead air on all of them. I checked with the duty officer, who told me Emily had missed her midnight check-in. Search teams were already being organized. We spent 3 days looking for her. Every inch of the perimeter, every building, every vehicle on base. Her patrol route should have kept her within a half-mile radius of the main compound. But we found no trace of her. No footprints, no dropped equipment, no signs of struggle. On the 4th day, a search team found her body in a ditch about 2 miles east of the base. The medic said she'd been dead since the night of the power outage. But her injuries didn't make sense. Falls didn't leave marks like that. Animals didn't attack in such an organized pattern. The base commander ruled it an accidental death. Tragic incident during a power outage, soldier became confused in the darkness, fell into an unmarked ditch. Case closed, family notified, memorial service scheduled. I sat in the empty communications bunker that evening, staring at my computer screen and trying to process what had happened. Emily was dead. The friend who'd knocked on my door, who'd begged for help while something hunted her in the dark, was gone. I'd followed the rule. I'd stayed locked in my room like the email told me to, and Emily had died anyway. But as I sat there, another thought kept coming into my head. What if the voice in the hallway hadn't been Emily at all? What if something else had been using her voice, trying to get me to open that door? The email had been specific. Don't open your door for anyone, regardless of who claims to need help. I pulled up my email and found the saved copy of those rules, reading through them again with new eyes. They weren't random pranks or creative hazing. They were warnings written by someone who knew exactly what kind of dangers were around this place. Someone who'd learned the hard way that following the rules might not save everyone, but breaking them would definitely get you killed. 2 weeks had crawled by since Emily's memorial service, and I still couldn't sleep properly. Every night, duty felt like walking through a minefield where the mines might not even be real. The base commander had issued new safety protocols about buddy systems during power outages, but those felt like empty gestures. Nobody talked about what had really happened to Emily, at least not officially. I'd volunteered for extra duties to keep busy, which was how I ended up in the motor pool at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, checking fluid levels and tire pressure on the supply vehicles. Motor pool duty wasn't glamorous, but it kept my hands occupied and my mind focused on concrete, measurable tasks. Hydraulic fluid either leaked or it didn't. Tire pressure either met specifications or it needed adjustment. Simple problems with simple solutions. The garage bay doors were open to let in cool air while I worked. Banks of fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between the trucks and Humvees, creating a maze of dark spaces that I'd learned to avoid looking at too closely. I kept my clipboard handy and worked methodically through each vehicle, recording readings and noting maintenance needs. I was checking the oil dipstick on Transport 6 when movement caught my attention near the far end of the motor pool. Someone in military fatigues was walking between the vehicles, moving with the casual pace of personnel conducting routine business. Night duties meant plenty of people working various jobs, so initially I didn't think much of it. The person wore standard-issue camouflage that looked exactly like what everyone else on base wore daily. Average height, regulation haircut visible from behind, boots that reflected the overhead lighting. Nothing unusual about any of it, just another soldier going about his assigned tasks. But something made me keep watching. Maybe it was the way he moved. Too smooth, like he was gliding rather than walking. Or maybe it was how the shadows seemed to follow him instead of being cast by the lights. I found myself holding my breath as he made his way toward my section of the garage. He turned around. Where his eyes should have been, there were just empty sockets. Not missing eyes, not damaged tissue, just hollow spaces that went deeper than they should have. Dark voids that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it. The rest of his face looked completely normal. Regulation stubble, human skin tone, lips that could have belonged to any soldier on base. But those eye sockets were wrong in a way that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. The second rule crashed into my consciousness with perfect clarity. If you encounter a soldier in uniform whose eyes are completely missing, run immediately to the nearest building with other people inside. Terror hit me like ice water in my veins. My hands went numb around the clipboard, and I could feel my knees starting to shake. The person hadn't moved closer, but he'd turned his head slightly, like he was looking directly at me through those empty sockets. I dropped the clipboard and ran. My boots pounded against the concrete floor as I sprinted toward the exit, leaving behind tools and paperwork and any pretense of maintaining composure. The communications bunker was the closest building with someone inside. David was pulling the night duty, handling routine traffic monitoring and equipment maintenance. I covered the 100 yards between the motor pool and communications bunker in what felt like seconds as I reached the door. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly couldn't work the handle, but I managed to get inside and slam the door behind me. David looked up from his station, confused by my dramatic entrance. He had been working on some kind of frequency calibration, tools and testing equipment spread across his workstation. "Mike? What the hell?" "Lock the door," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "Lock it now." "What happened? You look like you've seen a..." "Just lock the door, Dave. Please." He must have heard something in my voice that convinced him not to argue. David got up and turned the manual deadbolt on the bunker door, then grabbed a metal filing cabinet and helped me push it in front of the entrance. The cabinet was heavy enough that nobody could get through without making a lot of noise. "Okay, it's secure," David said, watching my face carefully. "Now tell me what's going on." There was someone in the motor pool, a soldier in uniform, but I struggled to find words that wouldn't make me sound completely unhinged. His eyes were missing, not injured, not damaged, just empty sockets where eyes should be. David stared at me for several seconds, thinking about what I'd said. I expected him to laugh, to suggest I was tired or stressed or seeing things that weren't there. Instead, he went very quiet and looked toward the blocked door. "You're sure about what you saw?" "Positive." He looked normal from behind, but when he turned around, I shuddered, remembering those dark voids. It was exactly like the email described, the rules about running from soldiers with missing eyes. David's expression shifted from confusion to something much more serious. He went to his workstation and turned down the radio volume, then checked that all the window blinds were closed. "I got that email too," he said quietly. "About a month before you did. You never told me that." "I deleted it. Same as you did. Same as probably everyone else who gets those messages." David sat down heavily in his chair. Figured it was someone messing around, trying to freak people out. We spent the next 6 hours in that bunker, taking turns watching the door and windows while the other tried to rest. Neither of us actually slept, but we kept quiet and stayed alert. Every small sound outside made us both tense up. Wind rattling loose metal, vehicles passing on distant roads, the normal background noise of a base that never completely shut down. Around 5:30 in the morning, the first traces of dawn started showing through the blinds. We waited another hour before moving the filing cabinet and unlocking the door. The morning air felt cold and clean as we stepped outside, normal in a way that made the previous night seem like a bad dream. I led David back to the motor pool, where everything looked exactly as it should. My clipboard lay where I'd dropped it near Transport 6, tools scattered around from my hasty exit. No footprints in the dust, no signs that anyone else had been there. The garage looked like any other military facility, functional, well-maintained, completely ordinary. "Nothing here," David said, but he was scanning the shadows between vehicles like he expected something to emerge. "I know what I saw. I believe you." David picked up my clipboard and handed it back to me. "That email wasn't a prank, was it? Someone's been trying to warn people about actual threats." That realization hit both of us as we stood there in the empty motor pool. All the weird stories other soldiers had mentioned in passing, the unexplained accidents and disappearances that command attributed to equipment failures or training incidents. None of it was random. Something unnatural was happening at this base, and whoever had sent those rules knew exactly what kind of dangers personnel faced. The specific details of each warning, the clinical tone, the detailed instructions for survival. They'd been written by someone who understood these threats intimately. "We need to be more careful," I said, gathering up the scattered tools. "Both of us. Night shifts, solo assignments, anything that puts us alone in dark places." David nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes that probably matched my own. We'd spent weeks dismissing the supernatural as elaborate pranks, but now we understood the truth. The rules weren't jokes designed to frighten new soldiers. They were a survival manual written by someone who wanted us to live long enough to finish our deployments. The supply run to Colorado Springs had taken longer than expected, and I was already pushing the limits of what anyone would call responsible timing. 3 hours of driving mountain roads to pick up specialized communications equipment, another hour waiting for the supply clerk to locate everything on my requisition list. Then the slow trip back through winding highways as afternoon turned into evening. I should have stayed overnight at Peterson Air Force Base and returned in the morning. Standing protocol suggested it, common sense demanded it, and every instinct I'd developed over the past month screamed at me to avoid being alone after dark. But the replacement parts were needed for morning operations, and I'd convinced myself that getting back to base before full nightfall would be safe enough. That confidence disappeared the moment I saw the moon. It hung massive and perfectly round above the mountain peaks, turning everything into silver light that made familiar landmarks look strange and foreign. The kind of light that created deep shadows and played tricks with peripheral vision. I checked my watch as I navigated the last few miles toward base. 8:47 p.m., well past sunset. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the third rule repeated in my head with crystal clarity. Never be outside alone after sunset on full moon nights. The warning had seemed abstract when I'd first read it, like something from a cheap horror movie. Now, alone in a government vehicle with miles of empty forest on both sides, it felt like a death sentence. The base's perimeter fence came into view around the next bend, chain link topped with razor wire reflecting moonlight like broken glass. Security lights mounted on tall poles created pools of harsh white light every 100 yards, but the spaces between them seemed darker by contrast. 200 yards from the main gate, close enough that I could see the guard booth and feel the first hints of relief. That's when I noticed her. A woman in civilian clothes was walking along the outside of the perimeter fence, moving parallel to the road with steady, measured steps. She wore dark pants and what looked like a light-colored jacket or sweater, nothing unusual for someone taking an evening walk. Her hair fell to shoulder length, and from this distance she appeared completely ordinary. But something about her movement made my skin crawl. Too smooth, like she was gliding rather than walking. Too purposeful, as if she knew exactly where she was going and why. Her pace never varied, never paused, never showed the small irregularities that mark normal human movement. She moved like a machine programmed to simulate walking, but not quite getting the details right. I forced myself to keep looking straight ahead at the road, using only peripheral vision to track her position. The rule had been specific about avoiding eye contact with civilians near the perimeter during full moons. Something about the clinical way it was written suggested that particular warning had been learned through bitter experience. The distance between us closed as I approached the gate. 50 yards, 40, 30. I could make out more details now without looking directly. Average height, slim build, clothes that seemed oddly clean for someone walking along a rural fence line. She showed no reaction to my vehicle's headlights or engine noise, just continued that eerie, steady progress along the perimeter. 25 yards away, I caught a glimpse of her face in my peripheral vision and nearly drove off the road. Her features kept changing, blurring and reforming like a photograph taken with a shaky camera. The basic shape was human, eyes, nose, mouth in roughly the right places, but none of it stayed consistent. One moment she looked young, the next older, then somewhere in between. Her skin tone changed from pale to olive to something that didn't belong on any human being. It was like watching someone's face being assembled from constantly changing components. Terror hit me like electricity. My foot slammed down on the accelerator without any conscious decision, and the vehicle lurched forward toward the gate. In the side mirror, I saw her stop walking and turn toward me with fluid precision. Then she started moving in my direction. Not running, not even hurrying, but covering ground with a speed that made no sense. Her legs moved in that same steady rhythm, but she was crossing the distance between fence and road faster than any human could manage. The changing, blurring quality of her face became more pronounced as she approached, like someone was adjusting the focus on a broken lens. I reached the gate doing 40 miles per hour and hit the brakes hard enough to leave rubber on the asphalt. The guard on duty stepped out of his booth, clearly annoyed by my dramatic arrival, but I was already throwing the vehicle into park and diving out the driver's side door. "Get inside!" I shouted, running toward the gate controls. "Lock it down now!" The guard looked confused, but hit the switch that closed the main gate. Security lights around the edge turned on automatically, flooding the nearby area with harsh white light. I stood there, gasping, looking back toward where I'd seen the woman, but the roadside appeared empty. Just asphalt, gravel shoulder, and the fence line stretching into darkness. "Sir, is there a problem?" The guard was young, maybe 22, with the kind of alert expression that suggested he took his duties seriously. "Did you see anyone out there? A woman in civilian clothes?" He shook his head, checking his monitors and looking around the area with practiced efficiency. "Negative, sir. Area's been clear all evening. You sure you saw someone?" I stared at the empty road, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe fatigue from the long drive, maybe stress from the past month's events, maybe just my overactive imagination turning shadows into threats. But the memory of those changing features remained vivid and wrong in a way that felt impossible to fake. "Equipment problems," I lied, grabbing my gear from the vehicle. "Thought I saw something wrong with the fence sensors." The guard nodded and made a note in his log, routine paperwork for a routine evening. I signed in and headed for the communications bunker to store the replacement parts, but my hands were still shaking as I filled out the equipment transfer forms. I spent the rest of the night in the mess hall, nursing coffee and reading technical manuals while a dozen other soldiers played cards, watched television, or worked on personal projects. Nobody questioned my presence. Night owls were common enough on base, and the mess hall stayed open 24 hours for shift workers. Around 2 a.m, James Rodriguez appeared with his usual cup of black coffee and settled into the chair across from me. His weathered face showed the strain of another sleepless night, salt and pepper hair looking more gray than usual under the fluorescent lights. "Rough evening?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice low enough that other soldiers couldn't overhear. "Supply run went longer than expected. Got back after sunset." I met his eyes, hoping he'd understand what I wasn't saying directly. James nodded slowly, taking a careful sip of his coffee. "Full moon tonight. Beautiful, but not always safe for solo travel in these mountains. I saw someone near the perimeter fence, civilian woman, but..." I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insane. Something felt wrong about her. Others have mentioned similar sightings, James said carefully, especially during certain lunar phases. Local wildlife can play tricks on tired drivers, make you see things that aren't quite what they appear to be. His tone suggested we were discussing perfectly normal phenomena, but his eyes held the same understanding I'd seen after the motor pool incident. James knew exactly what I was talking about, had probably heard similar reports from other soldiers over the years. The important thing is you made it back safely, he continued. Base security protocols exist for good reasons, even if those reasons aren't always obvious. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching other soldiers go about their evening routines. The mess hall felt warm and normal, filled with the kind of ordinary human activity that pushed supernatural fears back into the realm of bad dreams and overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen near that fence line. The changing features, the inhuman speed, the way she'd moved like something pretending to be human without quite understanding how humans actually worked. Another piece of evidence that the rules weren't elaborate pranks or psychological warfare. They were survival instructions written by someone who understood exactly what kind of dangers lurked in the darkness around our isolated mountain base. Someone who wanted us to live long enough to complete our deployments and return home safely. I finished my coffee and headed back to my quarters, keeping to well-lit paths and staying alert for any sign of movement in the shadows. Dave was already asleep when I entered our room, breathing deeply with the relaxed rhythm of someone who'd spent his evening safely indoors. I got onto my bunk without turning on any lights, listening to the sounds of a military base at night. Generators buzzing, distant radio chatter, footsteps in corridors, all the normal background noise that meant civilization and safety. The rules had saved my life again. Following them meant accepting that reality worked differently in this place, that supernatural threats existed alongside routine military operations. It meant living with constant watchfulness and the knowledge that a single mistake could be fatal. But it also meant I'd learned to recognize the dangers before they could kill me. The email's mysterious sender had given me the tools I needed to survive whatever else might emerge from the Colorado wilderness. I just had to be disciplined enough to keep using them. I barely managed 3 hours of sleep before my internal clock dragged me back to consciousness. The morning light coming through our small window felt harsh and unwelcome after the long night in the mess hall with James. Dave was already up, moving around the room with his usual efficiency while getting ready for his shift. "You look like hell," he said, glancing over as I sat up on my bunk. "Late night?" "Something like that." I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering exhaustion. Coffee. Need coffee. The mess hall was busier than usual for 7 in the morning, filled with personnel grabbing breakfast before day starts began. I spotted James at a corner table with Sarah, both of them nursing steaming mugs and speaking in low voices. Something about their posture suggested this wasn't casual conversation. Dave and I got our coffee and joined them. Sarah looked up as we approached, her expression more serious than I'd seen since arriving at the base. She had a manila folder open on the table, filled with what looked like personnel records and incident reports. "Mike," James said quietly. "Dave. Good timing. We need to talk." I settled into the plastic chair, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "About last night?" "About everything." Sarah leaned forward, keeping her voice low enough that other soldiers couldn't overhear. James filled me in on some details about the base history, things that aren't exactly public knowledge. James took a careful sip of his coffee, eyes looking around the room to make sure we weren't attracting attention. "Those emails you've been getting? They've been circulating for over 3 years now. Always the same pattern. New soldiers receive them within a few weeks of arrival, always from that same untraceable sender." 3 years? Dave's voice carried a note of disbelief. "How many people have gotten them?" "Most personnel who've been stationed here," James replied. "Some delete them immediately. Others save them as curiosities. A few learn to take them seriously after they witness something that shouldn't exist." Sarah flipped through several pages in her folder, stopping at what looked like a casualty report. I spent the night pulling records from the personnel database. 27 soldiers have died or disappeared from this base in the past 5 years. The number shocked me. 27? That's nearly 6 times the expected rate for remote installations of this size, Sarah continued, her analytical nature taking over. The Army considers 1 or 2 casualties per year normal for bases in challenging terrain. We've been averaging more than 5. I thought about Emily, about the search teams finding her body 2 miles from where she should have been patrolling, about the medic's report of injuries that didn't match any known type of accident or animal attack. Command knows about this? Dave asked. James nodded seriously. Every incident gets investigated, documented, and filed. Power outage accidents, equipment failures, training mishaps, soldiers becoming confused during night operations. Always a logical explanation that fits standard military protocol. But you know better. We all know better now. James's weathered face showed the strain of years spent watching personnel under his command face inexplicable dangers. The survivors learned to recognize the patterns: missing soldiers during blackouts, sightings of figures that shouldn't exist, encounters with things that look human but aren't quite right. Sarah pulled out another document, this one filled with incident summaries and witness statements. I found reports going back to when this outpost was established. Similar descriptions, similar warnings passed down through unofficial channels. Personnel talking about rules and guidelines that never appeared in any official manual. The emails aren't the first attempt at warning people, James explained. Before those started arriving, information got shared through word of mouth. Senior personnel trying to prepare newcomers for what they might encounter, but verbal warnings were easy to dismiss as superstition or hazing. The emails are different, I said, remembering the clinical tone and specific details. More credible, harder to ignore. Exactly. Someone figured out how to present the information in a way that people might actually follow. James finished his coffee and set the mug down carefully. And following those rules is the difference between completing your deployment and becoming another casualty statistic. Dave was reading over Sarah's documents, his expression getting more serious with each page. This is all real, isn't it? The things we've been seeing, the warnings in those emails. It's not psychological warfare or elaborate pranks. It's survival information, Sarah said simply. Written by someone who understands exactly what kind of threats exist at this location. The truth of that hit our small group hard. I thought about my encounters with the eyeless soldier in the motor pool, the shape-shifting woman near the perimeter fence. Both times, following the rules had probably saved my life. Both times, breaking them might have added my name to Sarah's casualty list. Why here? I asked. What makes this base different from every other installation in the country? James shook his head. Nobody knows for certain. Could be the location, something about these particular mountains that creates unusual conditions. Could be something that was here before the base was built. Could be military activities that accidentally opened doors that should have stayed closed. Does it matter? Sarah's pragmatic nature cut through the speculation. We're here for another 8 months. Understanding the why won't help us survive. Understanding the how might. She was right. The source of the supernatural activity was less important than learning to get through it safely. The mysterious sender of those emails understood that difference, which was why the rules focused on practical survival rather than explanations or theories. The people who wrote these warnings, Dave said, tapping the email printout. Are they still on base? Unknown, James replied. Could be current personnel. Could be someone who rotated out but wanted to help the people coming after them. The anonymity is probably intentional, protecting both the sender and the recipients. I pulled out my phone and accessed my email, scrolling back to find the message I'd saved weeks ago. The rules looked different now, not like paranoid ramblings, but like carefully compiled intelligence gathered through observation and bitter experience. I'm forwarding this to my secure folder, I said, attaching the email to my personal backup system. If something happens to me, at least there'll be a record of what we knew. Good thinking, Sarah said, making her own copy of the documents. "We should all maintain separate records. Multiple backups increase the chances that future personnel will have access to this information." James stood up, picking up his empty mug and checking his watch. "Day shift's starting soon. We all have regular duties to keep up with, but remember what we've talked about here. The rules aren't suggestions. They're requirements for staying alive." "What about reporting this through official channels?" Dave asked. "Surely someone higher up the chain of command would want to know about supernatural activity at a military installation." "You're welcome to try," James said with a bitter smile. "But 27 casualties over 5 years suggests that official channels aren't particularly effective at addressing these problems. The chain of command deals with conventional threats using conventional methods. What we're facing here requires different approaches." As our group started to break up, I felt the full weight of my situation settling into place. The Colorado outpost wasn't just another remote assignment. It was a place where reality worked differently than the outside world, where following mysterious rules meant the difference between survival and becoming another unexplained casualty. The remaining months of my deployment would require constant vigilance, strict adherence to warnings I still didn't fully understand, and acceptance that some threats couldn't be fought using conventional military tactics. They could only be avoided through careful attention to guidelines written by someone who'd learned to navigate supernatural dangers through trial and error. I finished my coffee and headed for the communications bunker, where routine equipment checks and radio monitoring awaited. Normal duties that would help maintain the illusion of a standard military assignment. But now I understood the truth behind that front. The rules weren't just guidelines for surviving strange occurrences. They were a survival manual written by someone who understood the supernatural forces at work in these mountains. Someone who wanted us to live long enough to complete our deployments and return home safely. I just had to be disciplined enough to keep following them, no matter what else might emerge from the darkness surrounding our isolated mountain base.